Today we will be discussing Gaza. How is the West supporting Israel? And joining us is Charles Shoebridge. Charles Shoebridge is a writer, broadcaster and independent authority on issues related to security, intelligence, terrorism and crime. A graduate of history and politics and of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, he served for almost 2 decades in diverse frontline policing and military roles, specializing in counter-terrorism and intelligence operations. Prior to his service at Scotland Yard and elsewhere, he also worked in counter-terrorism as a commissioned officer in the British Army. Mr. Charles Shoebridge, thank you very much for joining us today. You have a background in anti-terrorism and intelligence. Maybe we start with you telling us what's happening in Gaza today. Is that terrorism?
When you say is it terrorism, of course, there are at least two actors taking part in Gaza. Certainly, I think if you're on the receiving end of high explosives, if you are being killed and maimed as a civilian, I don't think it matters really to you the technical details of how that is delivered, that explosive is delivered. For example, in the past, Israel and the West have, of course, frequently referred to suicide bombers, for example, as terrorists, even if they are targeting Israeli or perhaps even other military installations. And yet, of course, if that same explosive charge was delivered by an Israeli or, in other circumstances, British or American F-16 or equivalent fighter aircraft, the effects on the ground are the same, but of course we wouldn't obviously call that terrorism. I say obviously because from the West's media and governmental perspectives, it's ludicrous to suggest that is terrorism. But of course, when one looks at it with cold logic, then one can see that if the impact on the ground is the same, whether it's delivered by an aircraft or whether it's delivered by a suicide bomber or whether it's delivered by a Hamas rocket, the impact is the same. So we either call it terrorism or we do not call it terrorism. In a way, from the counter-terrorism perspective of, shall we say, an investigator, these are questions that wouldn't normally, of course, arise because they relate to issues of political interpretation. The investigator, of course, in an ideal world will be clearly focused, will think about logic, will think about objectivity, but he'll also consider the task that he's been set. And of course, he's not going to be investigating something that the government in his own country wouldn't call terrorism.
But why? I mean, from the sitting here as a Muslim or people who are pro-Palestinians, it's very obvious and clear to us. But coming from an independent perspective, say when we're talking about the West and how they view terrorism, just as you've explained, why this hypocrisy? I mean, what is behind it? What's the political implications? Why? Why this hypocrisy of calling one terrorism and not the other?
Well, I'd come back slightly on what you just said in terms of referring to the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. I've made this point myself, for example, on Twitter very recently, when Lady Wazi resigned from the Lords, from the British government a few days ago. There was a lot of commentary, for example, the BBC reported it, that basically in terms of clearly as a prominent Muslim, she felt that the government's position is untenable and that the British government's position in supporting Israel, at least to a large degree in its actions in Gaza, is morally indefensible. Well, it was an extraordinary take for me that the broadcaster of the state, the BBC, would say that or would imply that this is only the view of a prominent Muslim. You know, there are many, many people in the West, including in the UK, of non-Muslim faith, of no faith, in fact, who would take a very similar view to the majority, I think, mainstream Muslim view, which is that what Israel has been doing in Gaza and elsewhere is, as Lady Wazi said it, morally indefensible, as well as counterproductive. One must look at definitions of what one calls terrorism. If one looks at the law, it says that effectively, I mean, there are different definitions of terrorism around the world, which is one reason why it's been so difficult, of course, for the United Nations, for example, and others to come up with a unified definition of terrorism. But it's the use, really, of political violence, use of violence to achieve political ends. So you could see that in that respect, it could include even the targeting of military installations or military personnel. Certainly if a bomb in Britain, for example, was put down by Irish Republican terrorists, Islamist terrorists, as they're called under the law, against a military target or against a civilian target, it wouldn't make any difference to our definition of terrorism. So again, we've got this difficulty of what terrorism actually is. I like to use, which is my own personal opinion, so it's not related to the law or any governmental position, that if there is either indiscriminate targeting to the extent that civilians are almost certainly going to be killed or injured, or they are deliberately targeted, then I think we can say this is terrorism. Now, I would include in this strikes that are carried out, for example, from the air, where predominantly civilians are going to be killed. And just as a reference to that and put some context behind that, if we look at only yesterday, or the evening before actually, the United Nations revised its figures to suggest that 85% of those people killed by Israel in Gaza are in fact civilian. In other words, had nothing to do with military activities at all. And yet, from our perspective, the West perspective, it doesn't matter if it's civilians or military who are the targets. And yet, if somebody therefore is killing civilians, I personally would say that that is terrorism. You're trying to achieve a political goal, and for example, Israel clearly is trying to achieve a political goal, which I'm sure we will cover in more detail, by its actions in Gaza. But then so too, by that definition therefore, and the West has no problem with this definition of course, it includes Hamas and others firing rockets to into civilian areas. This tactic, this strategy, whilst it can be understandable in many, there are many different rationales for it, but the actions of Hamas and others in firing rockets towards, and in many cases primarily at civilian settlements and establishments, does to some degree arguably play into the hands of Israel and its Western backers, because it allows then Hamas to be labelled very conveniently for the West as a terrorist organisation.
That may be so, and I don't think there are a lot of people who don't condone even Hamas firing rockets. But if you look at the proportionality of what Hamas is doing as opposed to Israel, firing and civilian deaths, is there really, does it take a lot for a just logical person of no faith to sit down and decide who is a terrorist out of these two?
Well, in many ways, I think it's of course useful to discuss the hypocrisy of the term, because it really makes the term terrorism redundant. I think one can just say, does one have to say whether this is terrorism or not terrorism? In terms of governments, for example, in the West, terrorism is pretty much what is directed towards them. So therefore, of course, it is a politically subjective term, and which is the reason why there's been such difficulty in coming to this unified definition around the world. There still isn't one that's that's universally accepted. But in a way, we don't have to, in my opinion, worry too much about the terminology. We just have to look at whether one is right, whether one is wrong, and perhaps from a very clinical, more objective perspective, also whether one is likely to achieve its stated aims. So, for example, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, you mentioned the word disproportionality, and it's been a key word that I've been using over the last few weeks, because Israel's response to what's been happening, the launching of rockets against it, has been, of course, grossly disproportionate. And when you have such a deep degree of disproportionality, for example, we have something like 16 or 1700 at the present time Gaza civilians killed for 2 or 3 Israeli civilians. Now, all of those civilian deaths are to be condemned and definitely to be regretted. But there clearly is not a response of a state to the firing of rockets, which are largely ineffectual. And I say that these Hamas rockets, history has shown that these Hamas rockets and the other groups firing these rockets are largely ineffectual, irrespective of Israel's Iron Dome defense system, which the effectiveness of which has been subject to much technical debate. But really we can ignore it to some degree, because even before Iron Dome was in, and those rockets that have got through the Iron Dome system have caused very little damage. So there is this disproportionality, which actually then adds into a picture also of illegality, because of course to be legal your actions need to be proportionate to the threat. Now, many people have come back to me, for example, on Twitter and elsewhere, to say, well, how would you like it if rockets are being fired at you? And of course we would not like it. But I also would not, but it's a question really of two things. A, whether the response is right of Israel, and secondly, whether, which goes back to something I mentioned earlier, whether it's going to achieve the stated aims. So Israel, in its stated aims, has said that it wants to end a rocket fire. Then it said it wanted to end the tunnels being used that Hamas has constructed. And of course those tunnels, we should remember, have not just been constructed for, as Israel puts it, terrorists to be able to go through and attack Israel. In the vast majority of those cases over the last few years, those tunnels are used for smuggling the staples of life, food, medicines, as well as construction materials, etc., through those tunnels to beat the blockade, which is, at the end of the day is the basis of all that's happening, of course, pretty much in Gaza at the moment. But really, if Israel, and this is the message it's sold to its population, as well as its advocates, its protagonists in the West have sold it largely to the media here, that Israel is acting to protect itself from terrorism. But by this kind of strategy it's adopted, it's likely to provide a very counterproductive outcome. Because when you kill and maim, without an exaggeration, to say thousands of civilians have been killed and maimed by this onslaught in just a few weeks, you are, without any doubt, creating a new generation of what Israel will call terrorists who hate Israel because of what they have done in these last few weeks. And certainly a concern for people in the West, or should be a concern for people in the West, certainly people like myself from a counter-terrorism background, is that not only have Israel's actions created a generation of terrorists, as they would call them, amongst Palestinians and Muslims more generally to attack Israel, but also there is a fear, of course, a danger, or there should be, that the West's either standing idly by, or even worse, as can easily be argued, the West's facilitation and assistance of what Israel has done in the last few weeks in Palestine, in Gaza particularly, in my estimation, is likely to be the most radicalising factor that we have seen in creating what the West calls terrorists, probably since, and perhaps even more so, than the attack on Iraq in 2003. And so, far from actually ending the threat of terrorism, as is claimed for this operation, ironically perhaps called Protective Edge, it's not protecting Israel at all, and it's certainly not protecting the West, because it is likely to create the very terrorism that the West, or many people in the West and Israel, say that this operation is designed to prevent.
You've talked about the terrorism threat that Israel apparently has and has been discussing. But if we go back to very basics, how can we even discuss the issue of Israel being threatened of terrorism from Hamas or from Palestine when the land belongs to Palestinians, when Israel is actually the one that has grabbed the land from Palestinians?
Well, of course, beyond any discussion of, shall we say, the technical aspects of terrorism, even the legal aspects, one has to look at the broader political context from which this terrorism emanates. I mean, even in the West, or perhaps especially in the West, there is a multi-pronged approach to defeating the threat, or the perceived threat, of what's called terrorism. And of course, that means then that you have to deal with not just the actual acts of violence, but also what may have led to that violence taking place, and that means resolving, as Western leaders themselves are constantly saying, resolving the core political, socio-economic issues that create, at least in some people's minds, the desire, desperation, whatever one wants to call it, to carry out these acts of violence. But I think at the same time we have to recognise that there's a reality in the Middle East, and that is that Israel exists. Israel is not going to go away. Whether Israel has a right to exist or not is, in a way, an interesting academic discussion, but I don't think it's particularly relevant to the current situation. And now, there is also and its resolution. There's also, of course, argument and discussion within even movements such as Hamas as to where in the future this direction should be in terms of either recognising the reality of Israel on the ground or, and dealing with it to get the best possible outcome for Palestinian people, including in Gaza, or having a continuous and continual war against Israel that is not going to be won. The Israeli state exists. It's not going to not exist. And in a way, it's irrelevant really to the situation on the ground that many people in the Middle East, you know, to my own knowledge, wish that that was the case. Other than that, if some people take the view that we are going to be fighting to destroy Israel, to get rid of Israel completely, even though one can understand their mindset to some degree, that these are, if you like, an invader, a settler people that have come in and taken land that was other people's. The fact is now, for generations, for decades, this entity, Israel, has existed, does exist, will exist. And so therefore, in a way, it's like bashing your head against a wall to be fighting something that is just not going to change. Now, if you're fighting to lift a blockade, or you're fighting because your people are being killed, all of these are reasons that Hamas and others have given for their armed actions. You know, these are much more relevant, should we say, than the actual existence of Israel in itself, because one can be changed over time, but the other cannot.
Okay, let's discuss this a little bit more in terms of existence of Israel. I think there is a misconception largely that pro-Palestinians or a lot of Muslims, and I take your point that it's not only Muslims who are pro-Palestinians, but generally the idea is to wipe Israel out of the map, which is not really what majority of pro-Palestinians believe in, because a lot of people believe in the Jews or the settlers being there, but in a different outfit, not necessarily in the Zionist state that Israel is at the moment. So what is your perception? Do you think that the two-state solution that the West proposes, is that the way forward? Do you think that is the solution?
It's hopefully a solution, but of course it can't just be that a creation of two states. There has to be a situation where you have two states created, with a position of equity and equality between them. We can't have a situation where, almost as a token, some land is given to Palestinians and a state is created that nonetheless can be attacked at any time by, for example, Israel, that can be invaded, or that assassinations can take place. It needs to be, Palestine needs to be a state, and I think this is recognised by genuine people in the West, including politicians, some politicians, that it needs to be a state that is fully recognised as a state with all the rights of a state, and also that is given access to, for example, markets, to trade, to free movement of people and goods, in the same way any other state, and a state that is protected by international law, just as any other state is, so that really these two states then have a chance of existing peacefully together, because that is the key to it. And I also think it's true that even though it's widely used as a pretext for Israeli actions and for Western support for those Israeli actions, it's also true at the end of the day that Israel, along with Palestine and indeed all states, need to be able to live in peace and security. But that needs to be balanced, I think, with consideration of how do we best achieve this security and peace. For example, to use an analogy from the West, which I'm certainly more familiar with, it's been argued by our politicians in the West that, that for example, the United Kingdom or the United States, but let's stick to the United Kingdom at the moment, that its actions in Afghanistan, its actions in Iraq, even its actions in Libya and supposedly Syria, are designed to, at the end of the day, to increase the security of Britain by not having terrorism on our streets. And yet repeatedly, as people like myself have warned, and it's become true, we've seen that when so-called terrorism, I say so-called because it's defined that way, has taken place on Britain's streets, on almost every occasion, if not every occasion, the perpetrators of those acts have stated the reason, the rationale behind those attacks was because of the West's involvement in Muslim countries. And so in other words, it's become completely counterproductive in ensuring our security. You know, it's these actions taken in the name of our security, even though of course it can be argued, and I've argued, that these are just mere covering pretexts for our involvement in these countries. But, for example, oil is an obvious issue that could be raised in the case of Iraq, for example. But we need to apply this to Israel's position as well in the Middle East. Israel wants, and I accept, I think most people would accept, that probably the majority of Israeli people want peace and security. Because they can economically flourish with peace, they can become more powerful, and people generally want peace for their children. But it raises the question of how best to achieve that. And if you are constantly lashing out and carrying out disproportionate acts, in short, killing other people from other countries, including their children and their civilians on a massive scale, especially when you do this in the name of your own security, you are not going to achieve that security. And Israel needs to understand that, even if a two-state solution comes about, because there are very little legal holds, there are very little holds at all on Israel's actions. It has almost carte blanche support, unlimited support from places such as the US and the UK. And so as a result of that, there's very little to hold it back. There may be behind-the-scenes pressure because it gets to a point, for example, with the bombardment of Gaza in the last few weeks, where it becomes, or starts to become, politically embarrassing. And we saw that with the resignation of Lady Wazi. But generally speaking, Israel itself needs to understand, without these external restraints that barely exist, that its own security is actually undermined in the long term by these short-term severe actions it takes against people of other territories, such as Gaza.
That's right. I mean, by the actions that the Israelis have carried out in the Gaza, but also just generally the settlements that keep expanding, I mean, it's pretty obvious, honestly, that the two-state solution has failed. I mean, it's failed for a long time. There are so many UN resolutions asking Israel not to continue building settlements. They won't stop doing that. And therefore, there is never going to be a two-state solution. Why then is the West keep on talking about a two-state solution?
Well, there is no two-state solution at the moment. We know that. I mean, okay, the people say they're working towards a two-state solution, but you're absolutely right to say there clearly isn't a two-state solution. Obviously that's the case, but also, perhaps more to the point, there's no momentum towards that, other than in the words of some leaders. One could look at, take another view, I put it in just as a possibility, that when Israel is constructing settlements, in some cases this doesn't apply, but in some cases, one can see that in any sensible two-state solution, even from a geographical perspective, that those settlements won't exist were there to be a two-state solution. And so therefore, one can suggest, perhaps, that allowing and even encouraging those settlements is a negotiation ploy for further down the road, so that these can be so-called concessions given by Israel when it then stops this building. But we see, with the settlement building issue, again, the complete ineffectiveness, even if it's seriously intended, of overseas criticism. I mean, the UK, the US have, albeit gently, criticised Israel for the settlement building. These settlements are unlawful by international law at the end of the day. But until or unless there is pressure from the West on Israel to rein Israel in, then this situation will not change. And also, in respect of its dealings with the Palestinian people, one must look again, I think, at the broader picture. We always must look at this broader picture. And it's interesting that just before this Gaza offensive, of course, Hamas and Fatah came together, which, of course, was very much opposed by Israel. Even though one would think that in terms of having only one party that it needs to negotiate with, in terms of having a proper comprehensive settlement of the problems in that area, it makes a lot of sense to have an opponent, if you like, or another party speaking with one voice, as could have happened with Fatah and Hamas together. But, and some have argued, of course, that it's very convenient for Israel that they have been able to mount this onslaught against Gaza, which in a way, from some perspectives, could be seen as an attempt to drive a wedge between Hamas and Fatah or other factions, or alternatively punish perhaps Hamas and Gaza for its or Fatah for coming together with Hamas, or simply to completely derail the peace process that was heading towards a two-state solution. And again, I mention these just as possibilities because there is some arguments in favour of that, some opposed to it. But once again, if really those were primarily the aims of Israel, again, it looks like, it's early still to say, but it looks like, early indications suggest, that if this was the strategy, that this has backfired. Simply because, of course, when you are bombing and killing to the extent that Israel was in Gaza, notwithstanding that this is Hamas controlled, it's hard to see that Palestinians elsewhere in the West Bank, for example, are not going to sympathise with their brothers and cousins in Gaza, but also still see Hamas firing back, still resisting. And again, Hamas has inflicted, once Israel invaded on the ground in Gaza, very severe casualties on the Israeli Defence Forces. And therefore, Israel has given Hamas the opportunity to prove its fighting worth, to prove its commitment, to prove, as will be seen from the Palestinian side, its heroism in defending, as it will be put, the people of Gaza. And so therefore, Israel has completely, certainly to some interpretations, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, by its actions has completely strengthened Hamas, and probably has strengthened Hamas vis-à-vis Fatah, because it's given Hamas the opportunity not just to fire rockets towards civilian areas, but to actually fight on the ground against Israeli troops. Let's not forget here, this is an important fact to remember, because it will be quoted again and again in the future, I feel, that 96% or so of the people killed by Hamas in this conflict in the last few weeks have been military personnel. There are 3 civilians killed too. I think one of those was at an army base in any case, or a checkpoint. But of course that can be contrasted and will be contrasted with the 85% of people that Israel killed who were civilians, including of course many, many children. And so just to reiterate again that certainly by invading on the ground Gaza, Israel has given Hamas an opportunity which Hamas has absolutely taken by launching ferocious assaults on the Israeli Defence Forces that have resulted in very severe casualties for the Israelis, many more so than in their previous operations, which has undoubtedly raised the status of Hamas, not just in Gaza, but amongst all Palestinian people. And that may be proof counterproductive in the future.
You've explained a little bit about what Israel's aim might have been in dividing Fatah and Hamas. What do you think, from your background of intelligence, what really is the aim as far as Israel is concerned? Is it what we hear, from the river to the sea, conquering the whole of the Arab land? What is it?
It's very difficult to see when one looks at Israel's stated aims and the actions they carry out in pursuit of those aims, that there is a logical connection to them. That connection is there for the Western media and for the Western politicians who, of course, are supporting Israel. And one can certainly question the reasons behind the West's, certainly in terms of its ruling elites, in terms of the media, the government. One can look at the power of the Israeli lobby and so on in Western capitals, which we can talk about, I'm sure. And they, of course, use this narrative to justify or explain what Israel is doing. But when one looks at it logically, there is very little connection between what Israel says it wants and what it's doing. In other words, it wants peace. The way to achieving peace and not having threats in the future isn't to kill and maim thousands of civilians. You're just creating a problem for the future, which makes one wonder if Israel actually would prefer to have this constant so-called terror threat that can then be used to justify its security state, can justify the vast amounts of money that America sends in form of money and arms supplies. Because it's very useful for politicians and states to have this external or even an internal threat that they can use to justify their defence spending, their security spending, their legislative powers that are given to, or rather legal powers, I should say, that are given to, for example, security and intelligence services, the vast amount of spending on intelligence, perhaps control of newspapers and of opinions, social control in terms of, as we've seen in Israel over the last few weeks, where you've had a few hundred protesters on the streets protesting against what Israel is doing in Gaza, but that they have been widely condemned by their media and almost certainly by the vast majority of Israelis as traitors and so on, simply because they've questioned what their state is doing. Now, if there wasn't this perceived external threat, Israel perhaps wouldn't be able to take such positions against people who just question what it's doing. And I think it's the same that politicians also, of course, are enhanced domestically when there are these problems. It's very early to say, but we may find that Netanyahu's standing amongst Israelis, for example, has risen. Opinion polls and that may show that in due course. And because states, populations tend to rally around their leaders when there is a perceived threat. And the Hamas case, for example, this is an external threat. It's even better. And if that threat is removed, for example, by peace, this does not help politicians perhaps within Israel. And this, of course, is not exclusive to Israel. This is practiced around the world, where threats are used, whether real or imaginary, to enhance the status and position of politicians domestically. One only has to look at George W. Bush's perpetual war, as it would appear to be, that he, I don't think a US president has ever been defeated in an election during so-called wartime. So, hey, why not have war the whole time? But one can easily transfer that to the Israel-Middle East situation and see that there are many incentives for the Israeli state to not have peace. And that's particularly the case where, of course, even down to the basics of financial spending on arms, ammunition, over the last few weeks, Israel has spent an absolute fortune in very high-tech weaponry, albeit being used against largely civilian targets. But nonetheless, this weaponry is extremely expensive, but it doesn't have to meet those costs. America will pay for those. And of course, we should be facing the reality, and American audiences and British audiences should be facing the reality that their media doesn't really push to them or give to them. And that is that of the billions that America is spending, certainly hundreds of millions over even the last few weeks of dollars in replenishing ammunition, including precision weapons for the Israeli armed forces, the United States absolutely knows, and it's a strong term, but I use it, carefully. The United States government and people know that 85% of what they supply in terms of ammunition to Israel is going to be used to kill and maim civilians, including children. Beforehand, it could be said, well, we don't know how they're going to use them. We assume they're going to use them against military targets. But this resupply has taken place after these facts and figures have emerged and become, not emerged, it's obvious. And so, again, it comes back to the same issue that there are very few restraints on Israel, and Israel has certainly very little incentive to seek peace with its neighbours, specifically the Palestinian people.
Just before we come to the question of why the West is supporting Israel and all the lobby that exists, just it may sound like a very naive question, but is it really that cynical that it's the oil, it's power, it's money that makes people not think twice before killing thousands of children?
It's a complex, actually, I mean, you say it sounds naive. Actually, I think it's a complex issue. And therefore, I think it's understandable that there can be many different views on this. I think one thing is clear from not just what's happened in Gaza over the last few weeks, but also really what's happened perhaps throughout a long period of history in respect of the West, but particularly really since 2003. And that is that, certainly as far as the West media is concerned, and I want to make this point actually, it's a kind of like a point on the tangent of this, but we need to be very careful when we're talking about the West, distinguishing between the West governments, its media, and the West people. We need to remember, for example, Iraq in 2003. We had 1 million people marching on the streets of London to oppose that war before that war happened. If the media in the West, in the US, the UK, for example, had a much greater diversity of views, particularly in respect of, or narratives, particularly in respect of foreign policy issues, it's quite possible, in fact one might say really likely, that public opinion would be even more opposed to the country's foreign policies in the UK and perhaps even more so the US, because in the US it seems that the media is even more tightly controlled or narrowly defined in terms of foreign policy coverage. So let's get that distinction there. When we say the West, when I say the West, usually I'm meaning the West governments and the West media. Nothing I say can be used as a justification to say that we should be attacking Western populations and so on, or in any way whatsoever. These are criticisms of government and media, for example. So going back to what you're saying, that when we look at the situation in Gaza over the last few weeks, when we look at the situation in respect of West foreign policy for the last 12, 13 years in particular, one can see that there is a grossly disproportionate value put on the lives of some groups of people vis-à-vis the lives of others. We saw this in the Israeli conflict just now, where in order to have balance, supposed so-called balance, the BBC, for example, will devote as much news time to maybe 60, 70, 80 or more civilians being killed who happen to be Palestinians to one Israeli soldier's funeral. This tells you that, okay, they're trying to get balance, they say, but you'll notice in other conflicts, for example, Syria, we don't see funerals of Syrian soldiers. We haven't seen funerals of Iraqi soldiers killed in fighting against ISIS, for example. And so, and it's again the same with the Iraq situation, where estimates are upwards of around 1 million people have died from, as a result of the US-UK invasion of Iraq in 2003. But these are Iraqi people of different sorts, but they're still Iraqi people. It receives almost no coverage in the West media. And yet, if a Westerner is killed, and irrespective of which country they're from, it will get much more media coverage. So people will say, well, naturally, if somebody is from the UK, UK media is going to cover that more, and that's absolutely true. But these Israeli people are not from the UK, and yet they get the same amount of media coverage. And so one can imagine if Hamas had killed in 1 month 1,600 Israeli citizens, civilians, I mean, we have to pause to imagine what the news coverage and the government's response would be. In other words, that sends a very clear message. Whether it's intended or not is another matter. But it's hardly surprising that in much of the world, the West is despised for not holding their lives to the same degree as value as it holds not its own citizens, but citizens like us. And of course, so therefore, I think that's one reason, again, why the West is seen to not care about these things.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is running out, so we will have to end it here for today. And we've now come to the end of part 1. I'm sure you've enjoyed the discussions, and please do make sure that you join us again for part 2, coming to you soon.